The wind carried no mercy across the Arizona Territory that winter morning. It swept through the valley where Thomas Harper's 160 acres stretched toward the mountains, whispering through dry grass that hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. The land lay hard and unforgiving beneath a pale sky, the kind of sky that promised cold but no comfort. Tom stood before a simple grave marker on the hill behind his house. The stone bore only essential words carved deep enough to last, but plain enough to match the woman who rested beneath. Catherine Harper, 1848 to 1877. No flowery epitaph, no poetry. She wouldn't have wanted it. 8 years had passed since he'd placed that stone. 8 years of watching seasons turn, while his heart remained fixed in that terrible spring when fire and violence had stolen everything that mattered. His right hand moved unconsciously to the pocket of his worn coat fingers, finding the small circle of gold he carried there. Catherine's wedding ring. He'd meant to bury it with her. Somehow, he never could. The ring trembled slightly in his grip. His hand shook, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that lived in the marrow of his bones and refused to fade with time. Some wounds, he'd learned, don't close. They just become part of who you are. Tom turned from the grave without speaking. Words seemed pointless when the dead couldn't answer and the living had stopped listening long ago. His boots crunched on frozen earth as he walked back toward the house, a structure built from rough-hewn timber and stubborn determination. Smoke rose thin from the chimney, a fire he'd banked before dawn still holding against the morning chill. Inside the house held only what a man needed and nothing more. A table built from pine. 2 chairs, though one never saw use. A narrow bed in the corner with blankets pulled tight in military precision, a habit from his cavalry days that 20 years hadn't broken. On the wall above this fireplace hung a Winchester rifle, the 44-40 model that had seen him through more trouble than he cared to remember. Beside it, a yellowed map marked the boundaries of his land, each corner stake noted in fading ink. The morning routine began as it always did. Tom filled a basin with water from the pump outside, cold enough to bite, and washed his face with the same methodical care he'd learned in the Union Army. Shave, dress. Coffee boiled in a battered pot that had crossed half the continent in his saddlebag. The ritual required no thought, which suited him fine. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led nowhere good. By the time full light touched the valley, he was already among his livestock. 12 Holstein cows, each one representing $15 he couldn't afford to lose. 3 Morgan horses, sturdy animals bred for endurance rather than speed. The bay mare alone had cost him $75, a sum that still made his jaw tight when he calculated the debt it represented. Tom moved through the work with practiced efficiency. Check each animal for injury or illness. Ensure water troughs hadn't frozen solid overnight. Distribute hay with careful rationing, knowing his supply had to last until spring grass came in strong. These were the tasks that filled his days, the labor that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the past. The fence line demanded attention. 2 miles of barbed wire encircled his property, a relatively new invention that had revolutionized ranching but required constant maintenance. He found a section where the wire had pulled loose from its post, probably from a deer pushing through in the night. The repair took an hour working in cold that made his fingers clumsy and his shoulder ache. That shoulder bore a puckered scar the size of a silver dollar, a gift from the Battle of Bull Run in 1861, when he'd been 19 years old and stupid enough to think war was glory. A Confederate minie-ball had torn through muscle and bone, leaving him with strength enough to work, but never quite enough to forget. On cold mornings like this, the old wound sang its persistent song of pain. The memory came unbidden, as it often did. Not the battle itself, but the field hospital after the screams of men having limbs sawed off without enough laudanum to dull the agony. He'd been lucky. The surgeon, drunk but competent, had saved his arm when others would have taken it. Tom had repaid that luck by learning to shoot left-handed to compensate when the right grew too weak or too slow. He pushed the memory away and returned to the present, to the fence that needed mending and the work that never ended. This was survival. This was life reduced to its essential elements: shelter, food, labor, sleep. The pattern had sustained him through 8 years of solitude. It would sustain him through 8 more if necessary. By midday, Tom had worked his way back to the small forge he'd built near the barn. He wasn't a true blacksmith, but frontier life demanded a man learn multiple trades or pay others for work he couldn't afford. The forge stood cold now, its coals dead since yesterday. He'd been preparing to reshoe the bay mare when weather had turned his attention elsewhere. He knelt beside the anvil, checking his supply of horseshoe nails. 50 remained in the tin, enough for another month if he was careful. The nails had cost 2 cents each in Prescott, the nearest town 15 miles south. Every expenditure mattered when your total wealth amounted to land, livestock, and a banknote for $50 due in 2 months. The financial calculation ran through his mind with the automatic precision of long practice. The land itself had cost him $200 under the Homestead Act of 1862, paid out at $1.25 per acre for the required 160. The cows represented another 180, the horses nearly 250. Against this, he owed the bank $50 for spring seed he'd needed to plant the small wheat field behind the barn. On paper, he was worth perhaps $500 after debts. In reality, he owned what he could defend and keep nothing more. The land grant gave him legal title, but legal title meant little this far from established law. What mattered was the Winchester on the wall and his willingness to use it. Tom stood brushing dirt from his knees and looked across his property. The house small but solid, the barn adequate for his needs, the livestock healthy despite the hard winter. He'd built this from nothing, carved it from raw land with his own hands and the sweat of 18-hour days. It should have meant something. It should have felt like achievement. Instead, it felt empty. The realization hit him, as it sometimes did, sudden and unwelcome. He'd survived the war, survived the hard years after, built a home, claimed land, established himself as a man of property, however modest. But survival wasn't the same as living, and property wasn't the same as having something worth protecting beyond mere existence. Catherine would have understood. She'd always understood things he couldn't put into words. But Catherine lay on the hill under that plain stone marker, and understanding died with her 8 years past. Tom shook his head, angry at himself for the sentiment. Self-pity was a luxury. He couldn't afford a weakness he'd trained himself to reject. The work remained. The land demanded attention, whether his heart was in it or not. He would continue because continuing was what men did when stopping meant surrender. He walked toward the house, intending to prepare a simple midday meal. Beans from a tin, hardtack softened in coffee, perhaps some salt pork if his stores allowed the extravagance. The menu never varied much. Cooking for one person took the pleasure out of food, reduced it to fuel for the body's engine. The house came into view as he crested a small rise. Something was wrong. Tom stopped walking. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 revolver holstered at his hip, a weapon he wore as naturally as other men wore suspenders. Smoke rose from his chimney. Thin smoke barely visible against the pale sky, but definitely smoke. He never left a fire burning when he worked outside. Never. The risk of the house catching fire while unattended was too great, the consequences too severe. His heart began to hammer in his chest, an old familiar rhythm from the war. Combat veterans learned to recognize danger before conscious thought caught up, learned to trust the tightening in their gut that said something had gone wrong. That instinct had saved his life more than once. He trusted it now. Tom approached the house with careful steps, eyes scanning for any movement, ears straining for sound. The Colt came free of its holster, smooth and easy thumb resting on the hammer. 23 years since the war ended, but the reflexes remained muscle memory that outlasted youth and idealism both. He reached the porch without incident. Through the window he could see the interior of the main room. Nothing appeared disturbed, no furniture overturned, no signs of ransacking. But someone was inside. He could feel it the way a man feels eyes on him in the dark. The door stood slightly ajar. Tom always latched it when he left. Always. His fingers tightened on the revolver. Whoever had entered his home was still there, and they were about to have a very unpleasant conversation. He pushed the door open hard, letting it bang against the inside wall. The Colt came up level, pointed at the center of the room. His voice, when it came out, was flat and cold, the voice of a man who'd killed before and would do so again if circumstances required. "What are you doing in my house?" The room froze. Near the table stood a woman, her body turned slightly as if to shield someone behind her. She didn't scream, didn't run, just stood there, calm and alert, meeting his eyes without flinching. That alone told Tom she wasn't some random trespasser hoping to steal what she could carry. This woman had purpose. Two children stood close to her, partially hidden by her skirts. A boy, maybe 9 years old, clutching something in his right hand. Tom's eyes flicked down. A small whittling knife, no real threat but held ready nonetheless. The boy's stance suggested he meant to use it if necessary. Behind the boy, a girl barely 6, her face half buried against her mother's dress, watching Tom with wide, dark eyes that held fear but not panic. Tom took in details with the quick assessment of a soldier. The woman wore cotton clothing, worn but clean, a mixture of Apache style and white settler fashion that marked her as mixed blood or married into white society. Her hands showed calluses from hard work. The children looked thin, their clothes dusty from travel. A leather satchel sat near the door, the kind made by Apache craftsmen, containing what appeared to be their total possessions. On the stove, a small pot of water simmered. Inside, he could see a few wild roots floating, nothing substantial. Not a real meal, just something to quiet hunger. They'd cleaned up after themselves, he noticed. The floor had been swept. A blanket they must have used lay folded neatly in the corner. These were people with manners, with some education, not desperate criminals. Still, they were in his house, uninvited, using his resources without permission. Tom's finger rested against the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, but close enough to react if needed. The woman spoke first. Her voice came steady and clear, accented but perfectly understandable. No pleading in it, no false sweetness, just plain fact delivered calmly. "We did not mean harm. The door was not locked. We only came to rest." Tom studied her face. She looked about 35, though hard living could age a person beyond their years. Her eyes carried the kind of tiredness that came from more than one sleepless night. This was exhaustion built over weeks, maybe months. The haunted look of someone who'd been running for a long time with nowhere safe to stop. "Who are you?" His tone remained firm, but the edge had softened slightly. Whatever these people were, they didn't fit the profile of thieves or troublemakers. "My name is Sarah." A pause, as if she was deciding how much to reveal. "I am a widow. These are my children." The word widow hung in the air between them. Tom knew that word intimately, knew the weight it carried and the loneliness it described. His hand lowered slightly, though he didn't holster the weapon yet. "Where's your wagon?" "Your supplies." Sarah's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. Shame, perhaps, or anger at circumstances beyond her control. "Our wagon broke down, 5 miles east near the Salt Creek crossing. We walked all day to find shelter. The night was coming. The cold." She glanced at her children. "We would not have survived outside." Tom believed her. He knew the country around Salt Creek, knew the terrain and the dangers. A broken wagon in winter meant death for anyone caught without shelter. The temperature last night had dropped well below freezing. In another few hours of exposure, especially for children, hypothermia would have finished what exhaustion started. He looked at the boy again. The child stood straighter than his years suggested, jaw set, ready to protect his mother and sister with a knife that would be useless against a grown man with a gun. There was pride in that stance, dignity, despite obvious poverty. The girl peeked out from behind her mother, and Tom caught sight of a scar on the woman's wrist, an old mark that spoke of restraints of time and chains. Apache, he thought. Or part Apache. During the long wars between settlers and tribes, captured Apache were sometimes shackled, sometimes imprisoned. This woman had known bondage at some point, had known the particular degradation of being held against her will. Something in his chest twisted. Catherine had hated the Apache. not from prejudice but from fear born of living on the frontier where raids happened and people died. Yet she'd also believed in mercy, in helping those who needed it, regardless of their blood. She'd once set the broken leg of an Apache woman found injured near their property, had risked her own safety to do it. The irony of her death coming at Apache hands had haunted Tom for 8 years. "You should not enter a stranger's house," he said quietly. "It can be dangerous." Sarah met his gaze directly. "I know, but sometimes there is no safe choice, only the least harmful one." The truth of that statement settled over him. He'd made such choices himself during the war and after. Decisions where every option carried risk, where survival meant picking the lesser evil and hoping you'd guessed right. Tom lowered the Colt completely and set it on the table, though still within easy reach. The gesture wasn't trust exactly, more like a temporary truce while he figured out what to do with these unexpected guests. "How long have you been on the road?" Sarah relaxed fractionally enough to show him how tense she'd been holding herself. "Weeks. We left our land after it was taken from us." Her voice tightened. "My husband passed away 2 years ago. Without him, doors closed. People who once helped us turned away." Tom understood that too. The frontier could be generous to families but harsh to lone women, especially those of mixed blood. Society's charity extended only so far before suspicion and prejudice took over. He walked to the water pump near the stove and filled a tin cup, set it on the table. The boy hesitated, then moved forward carefully and drank. His sister followed. Tom noticed how Sarah made sure both children drank before taking any herself, how she rationed the water as if even that simple resource might run out. Outside, the wind picked up. Dust tapped against the window like impatient fingers. Tom glanced toward the door, then back at the woman and her children. Logic said to send them away. They weren't his responsibility. He owed them nothing. Allowing strangers into his home invited trouble complications he'd spent 8 years avoiding. But the practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through war and hardship, argued differently. Night was coming soon. The cold would intensify. Sending a woman and 2 children back out there amounted to murder, even if he didn't pull the trigger himself. "Where were you going?" he asked. "Before the wagon broke." Sarah shook her head slightly. "Anywhere safe. Anywhere the children can sleep without fear." The simple honesty of that answer cut through his remaining resistance. He'd been sleeping without fear for 8 years alone in his locked house with his rifle within reach. These people had no such luxury. They lived in a world where safety wasn't assumed, but desperately sought, rarely found. Tom leaned against the wall and crossed his arms, thinking. The right thing to do conflicted with the safe thing to do, and he'd long ago learned that right and safe were not always the same path. Catherine would have helped them. Catherine had always helped when she could, sometimes against his better judgment. But Catherine was dead, and he was alive, and the decision was his alone. "You can stay until sunrise," he said finally. "Then you decide your next step." Relief flashed across Sarah's face, quickly controlled but unmistakable. "Thank you," she said quietly. The children sagged slightly, tension draining from their small bodies. Tom turned away, pretending to check something by the window. He told himself this was temporary, just one night of shelter. Come morning they'd leave, and his life would return to its normal, solitary rhythm. The intrusion would end. Everything would go back to how it was. But even as he thought it, even as he tried to convince himself, he felt something shift inside. The house had been silent for so long, empty of voices and movement and life. Now it held breath and heartbeat, the presence of other human beings who needed what he had to offer, however modest. The feeling unsettled him more than finding strangers in his home had, because it reminded him of something he'd forgotten. That loneliness wasn't just absence of company. It was absence of purpose beyond mere survival, and purpose once lost was a dangerous thing to rediscover. As the afternoon light began to fade, Tom prepared a simple meal from his stores. Beans boiled with a piece of salt pork, hardtack bread, the kind that could crack a tooth if you weren't careful, coffee for the adults, milk diluted with water for the children. Not much, but more than the roots and water they'd been subsisting on. He set 4 plates on the table. The action felt strange, almost ceremonial. 4 plates. 4 people. The last time he'd needed more than 1 plate had been 8 years ago when Catherine was alive, and they'd occasionally hosted travelers or neighbors. Since her death, he'd eaten alone every meal every day, watching the empty chair across from him and trying not to think about who should occupy it. Sarah helped her children sit properly, correcting their posture with gentle touches that spoke of someone who believed manners mattered even in poverty. The boy Daniel, he'd called himself in a brief introduction, sat with his back straight and hands folded until given permission to eat. The girl Emma mimicked her brother, watching Tom with cautious curiosity. They ate in silence. Tom wasn't much for conversation at the best of times, and these weren't the best of times. He observed them between bites, noting how Sarah ensured each child got enough before taking more herself. How Danny ate slowly, making the food last, savoring each bite as if it might be his final meal. How Emma held her tin cup with both hands, drinking carefully to avoid spilling a drop. These were good people, he thought. Down on their luck, and desperate, yes, but fundamentally decent. The kind who cleaned up after themselves, who tried to teach their children right from wrong, even when the world offered little incentive to maintain such standards. As dinner concluded, Emma did something unexpected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a dried wildflower, its petals brittle and faded but carefully preserved. With shy hesitation, she stood and placed it beside Tom's plate, then quickly returned to her seat without meeting his eyes. The gesture froze him. Such a small thing, this dried flower. Probably something she'd picked days ago and kept as one of her few possessions. And she'd given it to him, a stranger who'd pointed a gun at her mother and offered only grudging hospitality. Tom stared at the flower for a long moment. His throat felt tight. When had someone last given him anything without expecting payment or favors in return? When had he last received a gift offered purely from gratitude and innocent generosity? He looked at Emma, at her small face peeking up at him with worried hope. Slowly, carefully, he picked up the flower and set it in his shirt pocket, visible above his heart. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out rougher than intended. "I'll keep it safe." Emma's smile, when it came, was like sunrise after a long night, bright and unexpected and somehow precious beyond all proportion to the moment. She ducked her head, quickly, embarrassed by her own boldness, but the smile lingered. Sarah watched the exchange with eyes that saw more than Tom would have liked. She understood, he realized. Understood that he wasn't used to kindness, to small gestures of appreciation, that he'd been alone so long that a child's gift of a wilted flower could shake something loose inside him. As darkness fell completely, Tom showed them to the small spare room he'd built when he first constructed the house. It had been meant for children who never came for the family he and Catherine had planned, but never had time to create. The room held a narrow bed with old blankets, nothing fancy but clean and warm. "You'll be safe here," he said. "Nothing will disturb you tonight." Sarah nodded her thanks. Danny looked at him with something approaching respect, the way a boy looks at a man he's decided might be worth emulating. Emma clutched her ragged cloth doll and yawned, exhausted beyond pretense. Tom closed the door and stood alone in the main room. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Not empty exactly, more like a held breath, a pause between movements in some larger piece of music he couldn't yet hear completely. He sat at the table and pulled out his ledger, the notebook where he tracked expenses and income with careful precision. The numbers should have absorbed his attention as they usually did. Instead, he found himself listening to the soft sounds from the other room. Sarah's voice, low and melodic, speaking in a language he didn't understand. Apache, probably. Singing her children to sleep with old songs passed down through generations. The melody caught him. It rose and fell with a rhythm that reminded him of something, though he couldn't place what at first. Then it hit him. Catherine used to sing lullabies, 2 old Irish songs from her childhood. Different language, different culture, but the same basic human need to comfort children before sleep, to give them something beautiful to carry into dreams. Tom closed the ledger without recording anything. The numbers could wait. They always could. He sat in the darkness listening to Sarah's lullaby through the thin wall, and for the first time in 8 years felt something other than emptiness fill his chest. It might have been longing, it might have been regret, or maybe just a recognition that the life he'd built solitary and safe and controlled was also a kind of prison. That he'd locked himself away as surely as if he'd turned the key on a cell door, and these unexpected visitors had reminded him that other ways of living existed beyond his self-imposed exile. The night deepened. Tom didn't sleep. He sat by the window with his Winchester across his knees, watching the darkness for movement, not because he expected trouble from Sarah and her children, but because the world was full of dangers, and a man who relaxed his vigilance was a man asking to die. Wolves howled in the distance. The sound carried clear in the cold air, a reminder that predators hunted while decent people slept. Tom's hand tightened on the rifle. He'd killed wolves before, back when they'd threatened his livestock. Had to do it. Survival on the frontier required hard choices about what lived and what died. But tonight, listening to those howls, he thought about different kinds of predators. Human ones, the kind that didn't hunt cattle but people, that took land and lives with law as their excuse and greed as their motivation. Those predators were far more dangerous than wolves and far harder to fight. Sarah had mentioned losing their land, her husband dying, doors closing. Tom knew enough about the territory to read between those lines. Mixed blood families had it hard. White society barely tolerated them. Apache society often rejected them as tainted. They existed in the margins, vulnerable to anyone with enough power and lack of conscience to exploit that vulnerability. He thought about the scar on Sarah's wrist, about the fear in her children's eyes when he'd first confronted them. These people had known suffering beyond simple poverty. They'd been hunted, hurt, driven from pillar to post with nowhere safe to land, and now they'd landed here in his house seeking refuge he wasn't sure he could provide. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray before grudging gold. Tom had not slept. His eyes felt gritty, his body stiff from sitting in one position for hours. But he was awake and alert when Sarah emerged from the spare room, moving quietly to avoid waking the children. She found him by the window and started slightly, as if surprised he'd remained on guard all night. Their eyes met across the dim room. Neither spoke. Words seemed unnecessary. She'd been protected while she slept. He'd done his duty as host. That was enough. Tom stood and moved to the stove, started the fire, put coffee on to boil. Sarah watched for a moment, then began helping without asking permission. She found the tin of cornmeal, the salt pork, the few supplies he kept for basic meals. Within minutes they were working together in comfortable silence, preparing breakfast with the easy coordination of people who understood that talk was optional when labor needed doing. The children woke to the smell of food cooking. They emerged tentative and sleepy, Emma rubbing her eyes, Danny trying to look more awake than he clearly felt. Tom gestured to the table where he'd set 4 cups of coffee watered down for the children, but hot and nourishing. They ate together as sunrise finally broke full and bright over the valley. Corn mush sweetened slightly with molasses, salt pork fried crisp, the coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Simple food but plentiful, more than Sarah and her children had seen in some time, judging by how they savored each bite. After breakfast, Tom stood and pulled on his coat. "I'll check your wagon," he said. "See what broke and what it'll take to fix." Sarah stood quickly. "You don't have to." "I know." He cut her off gently. "But I will anyway." He saddled the bay mare and rode east toward Salt Creek, following the rough track that served as a road in this part of the territory. 5 miles through country, he knew well past landmarks he could navigate blind. The morning was cold but clear, good riding weather if you had the proper coat and didn't mind your breath frosting in the air. He found the wagon exactly where Sarah had said it would be. A sorry sight, old and poorly maintained even before it broke, the kind of vehicle that cost maybe $20 used and should have been retired years ago. The left rear axle had snapped clean through, dropping that corner of the wagon into the dirt. Repairs would require a forge new wood skills beyond basic maintenance. Tom dismounted and examined the brake more closely. His eyes narrowed. This wasn't a clean break from stress or age. The wood showed saw marks nearly hidden but visible if you looked carefully. Someone had cut halfway through the axle, weakening it so it would fail under normal travel stress. Sabotage. Deliberate and calculated. He stood and scanned the surrounding area. Found tracks. Multiple horses, probably 3 riders circling the area within the last few days. They'd been watching, waiting. Had likely seen Sarah and the children abandon the wagon and walk toward his property. And they'd let them go. Why? Inside the wagon bed he found Sarah's belongings. Pitifully few. Some clothing, cooking utensils, a leather folder containing papers. Tom pulled the folder out and opened it. Land deeds, survey maps, legal documents bearing official seals. He read quickly, his jaw tightening as he understood. Sarah's husband had owned 80 acres of decent land near Mesa, about 30 miles south. The property sat near where the railroad planned to extend its line within the next 2 years. That made it valuable, very valuable. Worth killing for if you were the kind of man who put profit above conscience. The name on the deed hit Tom like a fist to the gut. James Mitchell. He knew that name. 2 years ago, a man named James Mitchell had sent a letter to Marshal Henry Cole in Prescott claiming knowledge of land fraud and illegal claim jumping. The letter had caused a brief stir before being dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled settler. Then Mitchell had been arrested for cattle rustling and died in Yuma Territorial Prison before trial. Tom had heard about it. Everyone in the territory had heard about it. It had been one of those stories people talked about for a while before moving on to newer scandals. But he'd never connected it to anything that mattered. Just another sad tale of frontier justice gone wrong, or maybe gone exactly as intended by people with power. Now Sarah Mitchell stood in his house with Mitchell's children, and Tom understood with cold certainty that nothing about James Mitchell's conviction or death had been accidental. The man had discovered something, tried to expose it, and been destroyed for his efforts. Tom rode back to his ranch with the leather folder tucked inside his coat. His mind worked through implications and connections, soldiers' training clicking into place. Someone had wanted Mitchell's land, had framed him, imprisoned him, let him die. Then they'd gone after his widow and children, making sure no legal claim could survive to challenge the theft. But who? The territory was full of land grabbers and shady operators. Narrowing it down would take information he didn't have. Unless... He arrived back at the ranch to find Sarah waiting on the porch, her face tense with worry. Tom dismounted and walked to her, handing over the folder. "Your wagon was sabotaged," he said flatly. "Cut partway through so it would break." Sarah took the folder but didn't look surprised. "I know. They've been following us for weeks." "They who?" She met his eyes. "I don't know all their names, but I know who gives the orders." Tom waited. Sarah took a breath as if deciding whether to trust him with dangerous information. Finally, she spoke. "My husband worked as a surveyor. He measured land boundaries for homesteaders and ranchers. That's how he discovered it. The fraud. The changed boundary markers. Thousands of acres stolen from small landholders from Apache reservations, consolidated and sold to railroad companies. Who was stealing the land? Morrison Land Company. Frank Morrison. The name drove through Tom like a cavalry saber. Frank Morrison. Colonel Frank Morrison, as he'd been during the war, commanding officer, and the man who'd saved Tom's life at the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Tom had taken a Confederate bayonet thrust meant for Morrison, had nearly died from the wound. Morrison had personally carried him to the surgeon, had made sure he got care when others were left to die. Tom owed Morrison his life, and now Sarah was telling him that same man had destroyed hers. "You're certain?" His voice came out harsh. "My husband was certain. He tried to report it. The next week he was arrested. 3 months later, he was dead." Sarah's hands trembled slightly, holding the folder. "Morrison owns half the territory now, legally on paper, illegally in truth." Tom turned away, needing a moment to process. Frank Morrison. The thought circled his mind like a buzzard over carrion. Morrison had visited this ranch just once about a year before Catherine died, had offered to buy Tom's land for $400, a generous sum for property Tom had paid $200 for. Tom had refused. His land wasn't for sale at any price. 1 year later, Catherine had died in an Apache raid. Tom had never questioned the timing. Apache raids happened. People died. That was life on the frontier. But now, with Sarah's revelation burning in his mind, he questioned everything. Had Morrison arranged the raid, hired renegade Apache to attack to kill, to drive Tom from land he wouldn't sell? The thought seemed insane. Morrison was a businessman now, respectable and wealthy. But he was also a former cavalry officer who'd led brutal campaigns against Apache villages, who understood violence as a tool for achieving objectives. Tom's hands clenched into fists. If Morrison had taken Catherine from him, if her death had been anything other than tragic chance. "Mr. Harper." Sarah's voice pulled him back. He turned to find her watching him with concern. "Are you all right?" "No," Tom said honestly. "But that's nothing new." He looked at the children visible through the window, playing quietly with sticks they'd found in the yard. Innocent kids who'd lost their father to murder dressed as justice, who'd been driven from their home, hunted across the territory, left with nothing but a sabotaged wagon and a mother doing her desperate best to keep them alive. Tom made his decision. "Stay," he said. "Not just until sunrise. Stay longer. A few days. We'll figure out what comes next." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He paused. "I can't promise safety, can't promise anything will change, but I can give you time. A chance to rest and think. That's worth something." "Why?" The question came soft but direct. "You don't know us. You owe us nothing." Tom thought about that. About Catherine, about Morrison, about 8 years of loneliness and anger with nowhere to direct it, about a dried flower in his pocket and children who needed someone to stand between them and the wolves. "Maybe I'm tired of owing nothing," he said finally. He walked past her into the house, leaving her to follow or not as she chose. Inside, he pulled down the Winchester from above the fireplace and began cleaning it with methodical care. The rifle was already clean, already maintained, but his hands needed something to do while his mind caught up to the commitment he'd just made. Sarah came in and closed the door behind her. She didn't speak, just stood there, understanding that some decisions didn't require discussion, only acceptance. Outside, the wind continued its endless whisper across the valley. The land stretched harsh and beautiful under morning sun, full of promise and threat in equal measure. Somewhere out there, Frank Morrison conducted his business, built his empire, crushed anyone who stood in his way. Tom set the rifle back on its pegs and looked at Sarah. She looked back, this widow and her children who'd stumbled into his life uninvited and unwanted, who'd reminded him that survival alone wasn't enough reason to keep breathing. "We should talk," he said, "about Morrison, about what your husband knew, about what happens next." Sarah nodded. "Yes, we should." They sat at the table, two people bound by loss and circumstance, and began to plan. Not for victory, not for justice, just for survival in a world where both seemed increasingly unlikely. But survival, Tom had learned long ago, was where everything started. You survived first. Then you figured out what came after. And what came after, he was beginning to suspect, might finally give his life purpose beyond merely existing day to day. Might give him reason to use the skills war had taught him, the hardness frontier living had forged in his soul. Frank Morrison had taken much from him, from Sarah, from countless others across the territory. The man operated above law, beyond reach of normal justice. But frontier justice was something else entirely. And Tom Harper, for all his years of isolation and grief, remembered exactly how that kind of justice worked. The game, he thought, has changed. Morrison just doesn't know it yet. The first week passed in a rhythm of work and wary silence. Tom rose before dawn, as he always had, but now the house stirred with other sounds. Sarah moving quietly in the kitchen, preparing what little food they had. Danny already awake, waiting by the door with the eagerness of a boy hungry for purpose. Emma still sleeping, curled beneath blankets that had finally convinced her she was safe enough to truly rest. Tom said little. Words had never been his strength, but he showed Danny things instead. how to bank a fire so it lasted through the night, how to check a horse's hooves for stones before they caused lameness, how to read the sky for weather signs that meant the difference between life and death when you lived this far from town. The boy learned quickly. Tom noticed that. Danny watched everything with sharp attention, memorizing not just the actions, but the reasons behind them. When Tom demonstrated how to properly stack firewood so air could circulate and keep it dry, Danny asked why the gaps mattered, a smart question, the kind that showed thinking beyond rote imitation. Wood needs to breathe. Tom explained, his voice rough from disuse. Pack it too tight, moisture builds up. Wet wood won't burn when you need it most. Danny nodded, processing this. Then he restacked the entire woodpile on his own, adjusting each piece until the pattern satisfied him. The work took him 2 hours. Tom watched from the barn, saying nothing, but something in his chest loosened slightly at the boy's determination. By the 3rd day, Tom decided to teach Danny something more substantial. He led the boy to the small forge behind the barn, a structure he'd built with his own hands 5 years back when paying the town blacksmith became too expensive. The forge stood cold, its coals dark and dead. "You know what this is?" Tom asked. "Forge," Danny said. "For working metal." "For working iron," Tom corrected. "There's a difference. Iron's got character, temper. You can't just force it, you have to understand it." He knelt and began preparing the fire bed, showing Danny how to arrange the coal, how to create the right structure for heat that would last. The boy crouched beside him, mimicking each movement. "Why coal?" Danny asked. "Why not wood?" Tom appreciated the question. "Coal burns hotter. Iron needs real heat to become workable. Wood fire isn't enough." They worked together to build the fire, Tom's scarred hands guiding Danny's smaller ones. When the coals finally glowed red, Tom handed the boy the leather bellows. "Pump it, slow and steady. Watch the color change." Danny pumped. The coals brightened from red to orange heat waves shimmering above them. Tom selected a piece of scrap iron and placed it in the hottest part of the fire. They waited, watching the metal slowly transform as heat penetrated its core. "When do you know it's ready?" Danny asked. "Color tells you. Cherry red for bending, orange for serious shaping. Yellow-white means it's nearly melting. Too hot, you've ruined it." The iron reached cherry red. Tom pulled it out with tongs and laid it on the anvil. He handed Danny a small hammer, lighter than the standard smithing hammer, but still substantial in the boy's grip. "Hit it. Follow the rhythm. Don't think about strength. Think about timing." Danny swung. The hammer bounced off the iron ineffectively. He swung again, harder, with the same result. Frustration flickered across his young face. "You're fighting it," Tom said. "Let the hammer do the work. Your job is to guide, not force." He demonstrated his own hammer, falling in measured strikes that rang like bells against the anvil. Metal flattened beneath each blow, slowly taking the shape he intended. Danny watched, then tried again. Better this time. The 3rd attempt actually moved the iron. By the end of that first session, Danny's arms shook with exhaustion and his face was smudged with coal dust. But his eyes held something Tom recognized. Pride. The specific pride of a boy learning to do a man's work and discovering he might be capable of it. "Good start," Tom said. Just those 2 words. But Danny's smile suggested they meant more than lengthy praise ever could. Over the following days, the lessons continued. Danny learned to read iron temperature by color, to time his hammer strikes to the metal's cooling, to quench hot iron in water without warping it. His first horseshoe nail came out crooked as a dog's hind leg, but it was a nail nonetheless. Tom kept it, hung it on a peg in the forge where Danny could see his progress. Sarah contributed in her own way, never asking permission, simply seeing what needed doing and doing it. Tom came in from morning chores one day to find the barn door had been repaired. Its hinges oiled, the wood sanded smooth where splinters had threatened both man and beast. He said nothing about it, just nodded once in Sarah's direction when their paths crossed. Another day he discovered his clothes had been mended. Rips he'd grown so accustomed to, he no longer noticed them, now sewn with neat stitches that would hold through hard use. The sewing kit she must have used came from her meager possessions. Thread was expensive. She'd spent her own resources to repair his property. That evening, Tom left fresh deer meat on the table, more than they needed. A silent trade, value for value, respect acknowledged through action rather than words. Emma, quieter than her brother, found her own place in the ranch's ecosystem. She gravitated toward the animals, especially old Rusty, the bay gelding Tom had owned longest. The horse was 20 years old, if he was a day past his prime, but still sound. Most mornings, Emma could be found in Rusty's stall, talking to him in her small voice while she brushed his coat with careful strokes. Tom observed this from a distance. The girl had a gift. Animals sensed it, trusted her in ways they didn't trust most humans. Rusty, who could be cantankerous with rough handling, stood patient as stone, while Emma picked burrs from his mane and whispered secrets into his twitching ears. One afternoon, Tom watched Emma lead Rusty to the water trough. She'd done it without being told, without asking permission. Just saw the need and filled it. The horse followed her like a loyal dog, this massive animal responding to the gentle command of a 6-year-old child. Something about that image struck Tom deeply. Trust. Pure and uncomplicated. The kind of trust he'd forgotten existed in the world. Emma trusted Rusty not to hurt her. Rusty trusted Emma to care for him. Both proved worthy of that trust. Tom found himself smiling. The expression felt foreign on his face, muscles unused to forming it. How long since he'd smiled at something simple and good? How long since anything had seemed simple and good? The moment passed, but its echo remained. This house, for 8 years, a monument to isolation and grief, had begun to fill with something else. Not happiness exactly, nothing so grand or presumptuous, but perhaps the foundation upon which happiness might eventually be built. Purpose. Connection. The sense that tomorrow mattered for reasons beyond merely surviving to see it. By the end of the 3rd week, they'd established a routine that felt almost natural. Tom and Danny worked together most mornings, either in the forge or tending livestock. Sarah managed the house with quiet efficiency, stretching their limited supplies through skill and careful rationing. Emma moved between them all, a small presence that somehow made the spaces feel warmer, more alive. Then Robert Grant came to visit. Tom saw the rider approaching from a mile off, recognized the distinctive paint horse Robert favored. His jaw tightened. Robert was his nearest neighbor 5 miles west and the closest thing Tom had to a friend in the territory. But friendship on the frontier was complicated. It involved obligations, expectations, the burden of caring what another person thought. Robert dismounted near the barn, his weathered face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Tom, been a while." "Robert." Tom stepped forward, accepting the handshake. "What brings you out?" "Heard you had company." Robert's gaze drifted toward the house where Sarah was visible through the window. "Thought I'd see for myself." There it was. The real reason for the visit. News traveled on the frontier passed from ranch to ranch by riders and traders, growing in the telling like wildfire through dry grass. Of course, Robert had heard. Probably half the territory had heard by now. "Just folks passing through," Tom said carefully. "Wagon broke down. They needed shelter." Robert studied him with the shrewd assessment of a man who'd survived 47 years in hard country by reading what people didn't say as much as what they did. Passing through. That why they're still here 3 weeks later. Tom felt his shoulders tense. "Their business. My land." "Apache woman, I hear." Robert kept his voice neutral, but the statement hung between them like an accusation. "Half Apache. Her man was white, named James Mitchell." Recognition flickered in Robert's eyes. "Mitchell, the surveyor one who got sent to Yuma for cattle rustling." "That's the one." Robert was quiet for a moment, working through implications. He was a smart man, educated back east before coming west for reasons he'd never fully explained. He could connect dots faster than most. "She's got papers, doesn't she? Land claims. That's why she's running." Tom didn't confirm or deny. His silence was answer enough. Robert glanced back toward the house, then lowered his voice. "You need to be careful, Tom. There's talk in Prescott. questions about why you're harboring them. Questions from who? Morrison's people, mostly. Frank's been asking around. Says the woman's got documents that rightfully belong to his company now that her husband's dead and convicted. The name hit Tom like a physical blow. Frank Morrison. Of course he'd be involved. Of course he'd be the one asking questions, applying pressure, working angles. That's what Frank did. That's who Frank was. Morrison got no claim on Mitchell's land, Tom said flatly. Homestead laws are clear. Conviction doesn't void a deed filed before arrest. Robert raised an eyebrow. You've been studying law. Enough to know theft when I see it. A long pause. Robert shifted his weight, uncomfortable with where this conversation was heading, but compelled to continue anyway. Tom, I need to tell you something. About Morrison. About before Catherine died. Every muscle in Tom's body went rigid. What about it? Morrison tried to buy your land, back in '76. You remember. I remember. Offered $400. I said no. Did you know he came back twice more that year, each time offering more money? The last offer was $600. That's 3 times what you paid for it. Tom hadn't known that. Catherine had handled visitors when he was working distant parts of the property. She'd never mentioned Morrison returning. Why would she keep that from him, unless she'd been frightened, unless Morrison's visits had been more threat than offer? Why are you telling me this now? Tom's voice came out harder than intended. Robert met his eyes directly. Because I think you need to know. I think you need to understand what kind of man Morrison is. And I think you need to ask yourself why he wanted your land so badly. Badly enough to come back 3 times. The implication hung unspoken between them. Morrison wanted the land. Tom refused to sell. 1 year later, Catherine died in an Apache raid. The timing could be coincidence, or it could be something far worse. You saying Morrison arranged the raid? Tom asked quietly. I'm saying I don't trust coincidences, and neither should you. Robert mounted his paint horse, preparing to leave. But he paused, looking down at Tom with genuine concern. Be careful. Morrison's got power in this territory. He's got the law in his pocket and money to hire men who don't ask questions. You stand against him, you'll stand alone. I've stood alone before. Not like this, you haven't. Robert turned his horse. Watch your back, Tom, and watch those kids. Morrison doesn't leave loose ends. He rode off, leaving Tom standing in the yard with thoughts churning like storm clouds. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture ugly in its clarity. Morrison wanted land, Tom's land, Mitchell's land, probably dozens of others' land, all sitting on or near the proposed railroad route, all worth fortunes if consolidated and sold to the right buyers. And anyone who stood in Morrison's way ended up dead or destroyed. James Mitchell convicted and killed in prison. Catherine Harper burned alive in her own home. How many others? How many small ranchers and homesteaders had lost everything to Morrison's machinations? Tom walked slowly back to the house. Inside, he found Sarah preparing dinner, her movements economical and practiced. She looked up as he entered, read something in his face that made her hands still. What's wrong? Tom pulled out a chair and sat heavily. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then slowly he began to tell her about Morrison, about the offers to buy his land, about Catherine's death, about the suspicions that had been growing in his mind like poison ivy, choking out everything else. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat down across from him. Her voice when she came was steady, but her eyes held old pain. James discovered Morrison was changing boundary markers, moving them sometimes only a few feet, sometimes hundreds of yards, stealing land from people who couldn't afford surveyors to prove the theft. He tried to report it, tried to get the territorial governor involved. What happened? 3 days later, cattle went missing from the Morrison ranch. A week after that, they found some of those cattle on our land. James was arrested before he could explain how they got there. He was convicted in 2 days. The judge was a man named Harlow. Judge Harlow owns a quarter share in Morrison Land Company. Tom absorbed this. The corruption went deeper than he'd imagined. Morrison didn't just steal land. He'd captured the entire legal system, bent it to serve his purposes. A man like that was untouchable through normal channels. "My husband died in Yuma," Sarah continued, her voice dropping. "The official story was consumption, lung disease. But the prisoners we talked to, after the ones who knew James, they said he was healthy until a guard beat him. 3 days later, he was dead. Morrison had him killed. I can't prove it, but yes, I believe Morrison arranged it, just like I believe Morrison arranged for our wagon to break down, just like I believe he'll keep coming until we're all dead or gone." They sat in heavy silence. Outside, the children's voices drifted through the window, Danny teaching Emma some game involving stones and patterns in the dirt. Innocent sounds. The sounds of childhood that should be protected, sheltered from the brutal calculations of men who measured human life against profit margins. Tom stood and walked to the mantel where he kept Catherine's photograph, the only one that had survived the fire. She smiled out at him from behind cracked glass, forever young, forever gone. For 8 years he'd mourned her. For 8 years he'd blamed Apache raiders' random violence, the cruel chance of frontier living. But it hadn't been random. It had been murder, calculated and cold. Morrison had wanted the land. Catherine had stood in the way. So Morrison had removed her. The rage that filled Tom's chest was old and familiar, a companion from the war that he'd thought long buried. But it had only been sleeping. Now it woke, stretched, filled him with its terrible clarity. Morrison had taken everything that mattered, and Morrison would pay. He turned back to Sarah. "Tomorrow I ride to Prescott. Talk to Marshal Cole. See if he'll listen to what we know." Sarah shook her head. "He won't. Cole's a good man, but he's cautious. He won't move against Morrison without proof we don't have." "Then we get proof. How Morrison covers his tracks. He's been doing this for years." Tom thought about that. War had taught him many things. One of them was that every fortress had a weakness. Every enemy made mistakes. Morrison had grown confident, perhaps overconfident. Men like that made errors they couldn't see because success had blinded them to the possibility of failure. "We start watching," Tom said. "We learn his patterns, his associates, his weaknesses, and when we find the opening, we strike." Sarah looked at him with new assessment, seeing perhaps for the first time not the grieving widower or reluctant host, but the soldier underneath. The man who'd survived Bull Run and Antietam, who'd learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation when circumstances required. "You're talking about war," she said quietly. "I'm talking about justice. But yes, it'll be a kind of war." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Multiple riders coming fast. Tom grabbed his Winchester from above the mantel and moved to the window. 3 men approached, riding hard, raising dust. He recognized the lead rider immediately. Frank Morrison. Tom's hands tightened on the rifle. After all these years, after all the suspicions and growing certainty, here was the man himself. Older than Tom remembered, grayer, but still carrying himself with the same commanding presence that had made him a successful cavalry officer. "Stay inside," Tom told Sarah. "Keep the children back." He stepped out onto the porch, rifle held low but ready. Morrison and his 2 companions reined in their horses 20 feet away. Tom recognized one of the men. Billy Crow, a known troublemaker who'd done time in Yuma for armed robbery. The other was a stranger, but his tied-down guns and hard eyes marked him as hired muscle. Marshal Henry Cole rode up behind them, looking uncomfortable in his official capacity. Cole was nearing 60, a lawman of the old school who'd served honestly for 30 years. But honest men could be outmaneuvered by dishonest ones with money and influence. "Tom," Morrison said, his voice carrying the same easy authority Tom remembered from the war. "It's been too long." "Frank," Tom kept his response neutral. "What brings you out to my property?" "Business, I'm afraid. Unpleasant business." Morrison dismounted, moving with the casual confidence of a man who expected no serious resistance. "I understand you're harboring Sarah Mitchell and her children. I'm providing shelter to travelers. No law against hospitality. There is when those travelers possess stolen property." Morrison pulled a document from his coat. Mrs. Mitchell has land deeds that rightfully belong to my company. Her husband was a convicted criminal. His assets are forfeit." Tom glanced at Marshal Cole. "That true, Henry?" Cole shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "It's complicated, Tom. Territorial laws unclear on property rights when the owner dies in prison before conviction is final." "Seems clear enough to me," Tom said. "Man's got a homestead claim it belongs to his wife and children. Conviction doesn't change that unless someone proves the land was used in criminal activity." Morrison's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. "You've been reading law books, Tom. Impressive. But you're wrong on the specifics. And more importantly, you're involving yourself in matters that don't concern you. These people are on my land. That makes it my concern." "Is that so?" Morrison took a step closer. "Then perhaps we should discuss your land as well. I made you a generous offer once, $400 for 160 acres of rock and scrub. You refused. I respect that. A man's entitled to keep his property. But that respect goes both ways. You need to respect that Sarah Mitchell's property claims are legally questionable at best." Tom felt rage building but kept his voice level. "Get to the point, Frank." "The point is this. Mrs. Mitchell has documents I need. She can surrender them peacefully, or I can get a court order. Either way, those papers are coming to me. The only question is how much difficulty we have in the process. And if I say those papers stay with their rightful owner—" Morrison's expression shifted, losing its veneer of civility. "Then you're choosing to stand against me, against the law, against progress in this territory. That's a lonely position, Tom. A dangerous one." Marshal Cole cleared his throat. "Tom Morrison's got legal standing here. I don't like it, but he does. If he wants to pursue this through the courts, he'll win. Might be better for everyone if Mrs. Mitchell just cooperates." Tom looked at Cole, at Morrison, at Billy Crow, whose hand rested too casually near his pistol. This was the moment. The choice between safe retreat and dangerous commitment. Between accepting injustice to preserve peace or fighting back knowing the cost would be severe. He thought about Catherine burning in their house while he was too far away to save her. About James Mitchell dying alone in a prison cell, beaten and broken for the crime of honesty. About Danny and Emma children who deserved better than a world where might made right and conscience was weakness. "No," Tom said flatly. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "No. No court order. No papers. Not unless you can prove legal authority. Real authority, not the bought and paid for kind." The silence that followed held weight and threat. Billy Crow's hand moved closer to his gun. The stranger beside him shifted in his saddle, calculating odds. Marshal Cole looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Morrison studied Tom for a long moment. Then he smiled again, but this time the expression held no warmth, only cold assessment. "You know what your problem is, Tom? You never learned that loyalty has limits. I saved your life at Antietam, carried you to the surgeon myself when you took that bayonet meant for me. You remember that?" "I remember." "Then remember this. I call in debts when I need to. You owe me your life. I'm asking for papers in return. That seems more than fair." Tom's knuckles whitened on the Winchester. "I owe you nothing. You want to call this even for Antietam, fine. We're even. Now get off my land." Morrison's mask slipped completely. Beneath the civilized veneer stood something colder, harder. A predator who'd learned to wear human skin but never forgotten what he was underneath. "You're making a serious mistake," Morrison said quietly. "One you'll regret." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Morrison remounted his horse. Before leaving, he looked down at Tom with something approaching pity. "You always were stubborn. Catherine used to complain about it, said you'd rather break than bend." The mention of Catherine's name from Morrison's lips made Tom's vision narrow. His finger moved to the Winchester's trigger. One shot. That's all it would take. One shot and Frank Morrison would never threaten anyone again. But there were witnesses. Marshal Cole would have to arrest him. The law, corrupt as it was, would still function. And Tom would hang, leaving Sarah and the children alone and unprotected. He lowered the rifle fractionally. Not surrender, tactical retreat. There would be another time, another opportunity. War had taught him patience along with violence. Morrison recognized the calculation and smiled. Smart choice, for now. He turned to Marshal Cole. Henry, I'll be filing those court papers tomorrow. Make sure you're available to serve them. Cole nodded miserably. Morrison and his men rode off Billy Crow, casting one last threatening look toward the house where Danny and Emma watched from the window. When they were gone, Cole dismounted and walked to Tom. I'm sorry, I truly am. But Morrison's got the law sewn up tight. There's nothing I can do. You could refuse to serve his papers and be replaced by someone worse. At least I can make sure things stay legal even if the law's being bent. Another marshal might just let Morrison's men handle it directly. Tom understood the logic even if he hated it. Cole was trying to maintain what little integrity remained in a system Morrison had corrupted. It wasn't heroic, but it was something. How much time do I have? Tom asked. Court won't hear the case for 2 weeks, then maybe another week for the order. 3 weeks total if you're lucky. 3 weeks. Tom nodded. 3 weeks to plan, to prepare, to find leverage or make an exit. Not much time, but perhaps enough. Cole remounted, looking older than his years. Watch yourself, Tom. Morrison doesn't make empty threats. If you're really going to stand against him, you'll need more than a rifle and stubbornness. What do I need? Allies, evidence, luck. Cole paused. Mostly luck. He rode away, leaving Tom alone on the porch. Sarah emerged from the house, her face tight with worry. You shouldn't have done that, she said. Now he'll come after you, too. He's been coming after me for 8 years. I just didn't know it. Tom looked at her. Your husband tried to fight Morrison legally. It got him killed. I won't make that mistake. What will you do? Tom didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about Antietam, about the moment when Frank Morrison had pulled him behind Union lines while Confederate fire tore the air apart. Morrison had saved him that day. It was true. But the man who'd saved him bore little resemblance to the creature that had just ridden away. War changed people. Tom knew that better than most, but Morrison hadn't been changed by war. War had just given him permission to be what he'd always been underneath. A man who saw other people as obstacles or assets, nothing more. I'll do what needs doing, Tom said finally, whatever that turns out to be. Over the next few days, the consequences of Tom's defiance began to manifest. When he rode to Prescott to buy supplies, the general store refused to serve him. Peterson, who'd sold him goods for 15 years, wouldn't even make eye contact. Can't help you, Tom. Nothing personal. Morrison got to you. Peterson's silence was confirmation enough. Tom tried the blacksmith next. Same result. The man who ran the feed store. The pharmacy. Every business in town had closed its doors to him, acting on orders from Morrison, or from fear of Morrison, which amounted to the same thing. Only 2 establishments proved exceptions. Doc Hamilton, the elderly physician who'd delivered half the babies in the territory, sold Tom what medical supplies he needed. I've seen enough death, Doc said quietly. I won't participate in creating more by denying folks medicine. The other was Maria Rodriguez, who ran the Mexican cantina on the edge of town. She sold Tom beans flour and coffee without comment. When he tried to pay, she waved the money away. Morrison is bad man. You stand against him, you do right thing. This is gift. Tom tried to insist on payment. Maria refused. My husband, he tried to stand against Morrison 3 years ago. Morrison take our land, run us out. We lose everything. Now we have just the cantina. Is not much, but is honest. She met his eyes. You fight him, you fight for all of us. Take the food. Live to fight another day. Tom accepted with a nod of gratitude. Allies were scarce. He'd take them where he found them. Returning to the ranch, he found Sarah packing their meager belongings. The children sat on their bed, Emma clutching her rag doll, Danny's face set in an expression of controlled misery. What are you doing? Tom asked, though he knew the answer. Leaving. Sarah didn't look at him. This was a mistake. We've brought you nothing but trouble. The town's turned against you. Morrison's watching. It's only a matter of time before things get worse. Sarah, No. She finally met his eyes, and he saw tears she was fighting to contain. "We can't stay. I won't let you lose everything because of us." Tom looked at the children, at Danny trying to be brave to be the man his father would have wanted him to become, at Emma silent and sad, understanding that once again the world was forcing them to run. Something in Tom's chest cracked, not broke, cracked, like ice on a pond when spring comes and warmth finally penetrates the frozen surface. For 8 years he'd kept himself locked away, protected behind walls of grief and anger. These people had slipped through those walls without his permission, had reminded him that isolation was its own kind of death. "Stay," he said. Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand what you're asking." "I do. I'm asking you to trust me, to let me stand for something that matters." "We're not your responsibility." "No, you're my choice." The distinction seemed to reach her. She stopped packing, hands still on the half-filled bag body, tense with indecision. Tom knelt down so he was level with Emma. The girl looked at him with those dark, ancient eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. "Catherine told me something," Tom said quietly. "The night before she died. We were talking about the future, about building something that would last. She said home isn't where you're safe from the world. It's where the world can't take what matters." He paused, making sure Sarah was listening too. "You matter. Danny matters. Emma matters. Morrison's already taken my wife, my peace. 8 years of my life spent being dead while my body kept breathing. I won't give him you too, not without a fight." The room held silence thick enough to choke on. Then Emma did something unexpected. She slid off the bed, walked to Tom, and wrapped her small arms around his neck. Just held him. No words. Just the simple trust of a child who'd decided this man was safe, was worthy of affection. Tom froze. When was the last time another human being had hugged him? When was the last time he'd allowed anyone close enough for such contact? His arms came up slowly, awkwardly, returning the embrace with careful gentleness. Over Emma's shoulder he saw Danny watching with hope mixed with fear. Saw Sarah with tears finally falling silent and steady. "Please," Tom said, his voice rough. "Stay." Sarah crossed the room and pulled Emma back gently. For a moment Tom thought she'd refuse anyway, would take her children and disappear into the vast territory, running until Morrison or weather or simple bad luck caught up with them. Then she nodded. Just once. A decision made not from hope of victory, but from the simple human need to stop running, even if stopping meant standing in the path of the storm. Tom stood, looked at the three of them, this family that had stumbled into his life and somehow become something he couldn't imagine losing. "We fight then," he said. "Together. Whatever comes." "Whatever comes," Sarah echoed. That night they made plans. Not elaborate strategies. They had neither the resources nor the power for such things. But basic preparation. Tom taught Sarah to shoot the Winchester, correcting her stance, showing her how to work the lever action smoothly. She was a quick study, her hands steady despite lack of experience. Danny learned to stand watch, to read the sounds of night, to distinguish between normal nocturnal activity and threats approaching. Emma was given a simple task, but crucial if strangers came and fighting started. She was to hide in the root cellar beneath the kitchen and not come out until Sarah came for her. They were preparing for war, a small war fought by 4 people against odds that would make any sane person surrender immediately. But surrender meant death or worse, meant letting Morrison win, meant accepting that might made right and that good people deserved whatever evil visited them. Tom had spent 8 years accepting such things. He was done accepting. 3 nights after their confrontation with Morrison, orange light bloomed on the southern horizon. Tom saw it from the porch where he'd been standing guard. Fire. Big fire. He grabbed his spyglass and focused on the glow. The Anderson Ranch 2 miles south. The house and barn both burning flames visible even at this distance. Tom watched for 20 minutes, saw no attempt to fight the fire, no bucket brigades or water pumps engaged. The Andersons had fled or been driven off, leaving everything to burn. Morrison's message couldn't be clearer. "This is what happens to those who stand against me. This is what's coming for you." Tom lowered the spyglass. His hand didn't shake. His heart didn't race. He felt only cold calculation, the soldier's mind assessing threat and formulating response. Let Morrison send his messages. Let him burn ranches and buy lawyers and corrupt marshals. Let him do everything his money and power allowed. In the end, it wouldn't matter. Because Tom Harper had learned something in the war that Morrison seemed to have forgotten. Victory didn't always go to the strongest or the richest. Sometimes it went to those who were willing to pay a higher price, to sacrifice more, to stand when everyone else had fallen. Tom had already lost everything that mattered once. There was a terrible freedom in that. Nothing Morrison could threaten him with would hurt worse than what he'd already survived. Behind him the door opened. Sarah stepped out, followed by Danny. They stood together watching the distant fire paint the night sky in shades of amber and crimson. "Tomorrow we start," Tom said. "No more waiting, no more reacting. We take the fight to Morrison." "How?" Danny asked. Tom smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "We do what Morrison's been doing to everyone else. We learn his secrets, find his weaknesses, and when the moment comes we strike where he's not protected." Sarah looked at him. "You're talking about more than legal action." "I'm talking about justice, real justice, the kind that doesn't wait for courts or marshals to find their courage." She considered this, then nodded. "Good. James tried the legal way. It got him killed. I won't make his mistake." They stood together on the porch, 3 people and a plan, watching Morrison's warning burn itself out against the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But tonight they had commitment, purpose, the beginnings of something that might against all odds become victory, or might become their graves, but either way they'd face it standing rather than running. And sometimes Tom thought that was enough. Sometimes choosing to stand was itself the victory, regardless of the outcome. The fire burned through the night. By morning, only ashes remained. The Andersons were gone, fled to somewhere safer, somewhere Morrison's shadow didn't reach. But Tom Harper wasn't going anywhere. This was his land, his home, and he would defend it with everything he had for as long as he had breath. Morrison wanted war. He'd gotten it. He just didn't know it yet. The pressure came from every direction, relentless as winter wind. Morrison didn't attack directly. He didn't need to. Money and influence were weapons more effective than guns when wielded with precision. The bank sent another notice. Tom's $50 debt, not due for another 6 weeks, was being called in immediately. Full payment required within 10 days, or the property would face foreclosure proceedings. The letter bore Judge Harlow's signature as legal authority, the same judge who'd convicted James Mitchell in 2 days of sham trial. Tom read the notice twice, then set it aside. $50 might as well be $5,000. He didn't have it. His cattle wouldn't fetch enough at current market rates, especially if Morrison made sure no one in the territory would buy from him. His horses were tools, not luxuries he could sell. The land itself was worth far more than $50, but that was precisely Morrison's goal. Force foreclosure, buy the property at auction for a fraction of its value, add it to his growing empire. 3 days after the bank notice, Marshal Cole arrived with different papers. Court orders regarding Sarah and her children. The charges made Tom's blood boil. Unfit mother, immoral living conditions, contributing to the delinquency of minors by cohabiting with a man not her husband. "This is Morrison's doing," Tom said flatly, reading the legal language designed to sound official while serving purely vindictive purposes. Cole looked miserable. "I know, but it's a valid court order. Sarah has to appear before Judge Harlow in 1 week. He'll decide custody of the children. Harlow owns part of Morrison's company. This isn't justice, it's theater." "I know that too." Cole's voice carried the weariness of a man watching everything he'd stood for, his entire career, dissolve into corruption. "But I have to serve the papers, and Sarah has to appear. If she doesn't, Harlow will issue a warrant. Then I'll have no choice but to arrest her." Tom wanted to throw Cole off his property, wanted to refuse the papers and dare anyone to enforce the order. But that would only make things worse. Sarah would become a fugitive. The children would be taken by force. Running wasn't an option anymore. Morrison had made sure of that. Sarah took the papers from Cole with steady hands, though Tom could see the fear in her eyes. Fear not for herself, but for Danny and Emma. The territorial orphanage where Apache children were sent had a reputation. Disease, abuse, cultural erasure. Children went in and came out broken if they came out at all. 1 week, she said quietly after Cole left. What do we do? Tom had no answer. They sat together at the kitchen table, the court papers between them like a death sentence. Outside, Danny practiced his hammering at the forge, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal providing counterpoint to their silence. Emma sang softly to Rusty in the barn, her child's voice carrying notes of innocence that the world seemed determined to destroy. That evening, as twilight painted the valley purple and gold, Doc Hamilton arrived. The old physician drove his buggy slowly up the ranch road, his aged mare taking her time. Tom met him at the door, surprised. Doc rarely made house calls this far from town unless someone was dying. Doc, everything all right? Hamilton climbed down with the careful movements of a man whose joints had logged too many years. He carried a wooden box about the size of a hat case worn smooth with age. Need to talk to you, Tom. Inside, if you don't mind. They gathered around the table, Sarah included, at Doc's insistence. The physician set the box down carefully, his weathered hands resting on its lid. I've been the doctor in Prescott for 32 years, he began. In that time I've delivered babies, set bones, closed wounds, and watched good people die for no good reason. I've also kept secrets. Patient confidentiality is sacred, but sometimes a secret kept becomes a sin committed. He opened the box. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Tom recognized it immediately. Catherine's diary. She'd kept it faithfully, writing nearly every day about their life together, their hopes, their struggles. He'd thought it lost in the fire that took her. Catherine gave this to me a week before she died, Doc said quietly. Asked me to hold it. Said if anything happened to her I should give it to you, but only if the time was right. He met Tom's eyes. I think the time is right. Tom reached for the journal with hands that trembled slightly. He opened it to a random page, saw Catherine's familiar handwriting, and felt 8 years of carefully maintained composure threaten to crack. Read the last month, Doc suggested. March of 1877. Tom turned to March. The entries were shorter than usual, the handwriting occasionally shaky. He read, and with each line his understanding of the past rewrote itself. March 3, 1877. Frank Morrison came again today while Thomas was working the north pasture. 3rd time this month. He insists we sell. I told him again we are not interested. He was less friendly this time. Said things are changing in the territory, that those who don't adapt get left behind. There was threat in his voice, though he never said anything directly. March 10, 1877. Morrison sent his man Billy Crow with another offer. $600 now. Thomas doesn't know about the previous visits. I haven't told him because I know what he would do. He would confront Morrison, and that would only make things worse. But I am frightened. Crow looked at me in a way that made my skin crawl. When I refused the offer, he said Morrison doesn't like being told no. That bad things happen to stubborn people. March 17, 1877. I saw Apache scouts near the southern border today. They watched the house for nearly an hour before riding off. This is unusual. The Apache haven't raided this area in 2 years, not since the treaty. I wonder if Morrison... But no, surely not. Surely even he wouldn't. I'm probably being paranoid. But I gave my journal to Doc Hamilton today. If something happens to me, Thomas needs to know the truth. The entry ended. There were no more pages. 1 week later, Catherine had died in the Apache raid Tom had always believed was random chance. The silence in the room held weight enough to crush mountains. Tom closed the journal carefully, his movements precise and controlled. Inside, rage built like steam in a boiler with no release valve. Morrison hadn't just wanted the land. He'd threatened Catherine, had sent his men to intimidate her, had likely arranged the raid that killed her. For 8 years, Tom had mourned his wife and blamed cruel fate. 8 years of grief misdirected, while the man truly responsible had prospered, had grown wealthy, had destroyed other lives without consequence. "Why didn't you give this to me before?" Tom's voice came out flat, emotionless. The tone scared Sarah more than anger would have. "Because I was a coward," Doc said simply. "Morrison's powerful. Going against him meant risking everything. I told myself you were better off not knowing that it would only cause more pain. But I was wrong. I was protecting myself, not you. And I'm sorry." Tom stood and walked to the window, looked out at the land Catherine had loved, the home they'd built together, the future Morrison had stolen, and Tom had spent 8 years not fighting for. "Morrison's wanted this land for 8 years, Tom said quietly. "He killed Catherine to get it. Killed James Mitchell for the same reason. How many others, Doc? How many people has Morrison destroyed while good men like you and Marshall Cole stood by and watched?" Doc Hamilton's shoulders sagged. "Too many. God forgive me, too many." "God might forgive you." Tom turned back. "I'm not sure I can. I don't expect forgiveness. I expect you to use what I've given you. Catherine wanted you to know the truth. Now you do. What you do with it is up to you." After Doc left, Tom sat with the journal reading through happier entries from earlier years. Sarah gave him space, understanding that grief revisited needed privacy. But eventually she returned to the table, sat across from him, and waited until he was ready to speak. "We can't beat Morrison legally," Tom said. "He owns the judges, the lawyers, most of the law enforcement. We could take this journal to every authority in the territory, and it wouldn't matter." "Then what do we do?" Tom looked at her. This woman who'd lost as much as he had to Morrison's greed. "We get proof that even corrupt judges can't ignore. We get evidence so damning that Morrison can't buy his way out." "How?" "We break into his office. Tonight. Find his records, his contracts, his correspondence. Somewhere in those files is proof of what he's done. We find it, and we take it to someone who'll listen." Sarah leaned back, processing this. "That's illegal. Breaking and entering. Theft." "Yes. If we're caught, we'll be arrested. The children will be taken." "Yes. And if we do find evidence, Morrison will know we have it. He'll come after us with everything he has. He's already coming after us with everything he has. At least this way we fight back." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "When do we go?" "Not we. Me and Danny." "Danny? He's 9 years old. He's small enough to fit through windows I can't, quick enough to run if things go wrong, and old enough to understand what's at stake." Tom paused. "His father died without fighting back. Danny wants to fight. I'm going to let him." Sarah's instinct was to refuse to protect her son from danger, but she'd seen the look in Danny's eyes, the determination to prove himself worthy of the man James Mitchell had been. Sometimes protecting children meant letting them take risks, letting them discover what they were capable of. "If anything happens to him," she began, "nothing will happen to him. I promise." It was a promise Tom had no right to make, but he made it anyway. Some things were worth lying about, if the lie brought comfort. He found Danny at the forge banking the coals for the night. The boy's face showed surprise when Tom explained the plan, then excitement, then serious determination. "You trust me to do this?" Danny asked. "I do." "Mom won't like it. Your mother understands that sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks." Danny considered this, then nodded. "When do we leave?" 2 in the morning. Dress warm and dark. Bring nothing that makes noise." As Tom turned to go, Danny spoke again. "Mr. Harper, thank you for letting me help, for treating me like I matter." Tom looked at this boy who'd lost his father and found something like hope in a stranger's house. "You do matter, Danny. Don't ever think otherwise." That night, Tom didn't sleep. He prepared methodically, checking his revolver, counting ammunition, reviewing the layout of Prescott in his mind. Morrison's office occupied the second floor of the largest building in town above the general store. 2 windows facing the street, one in back overlooking an alley. The back window was the entry point. At midnight, Emma came to him. She held something in her small hands, turning it over nervously. When she got close, Tom saw it was a strip of cloth faded blue fabric that he recognized immediately. It had come from one of Catherine's dresses, somehow salvaged from the fire or kept as a remnant. "For luck," Emma whispered, pressing the cloth into Tom's hand. He knelt down to her level. "Where did you find this?" "In the barn, under old boards. I saw the color and knew it was pretty." Emma had no way of knowing the cloth had belonged to Catherine, no understanding of the symbolism. But somehow it felt right that this small piece of his past accompanied him into the dangerous present. "Thank you," Tom said, tucking the cloth into his shirt pocket where the dried flower Emma had given him still rested. "I'll keep it safe." Emma hugged him quickly, then ran back to bed. Sarah stood in the doorway, having witnessed the exchange. She said nothing, but her eyes held gratitude and fear in equal measure. At 2 a.m, Tom and Danny rode toward Prescott under a sliver of moon that provided just enough light to see by without revealing them to casual observers. They'd left their horses a half-mile from town, approaching the rest of the way on foot through shadows and silence. The town slept. Prescott wasn't large enough to maintain nightlife beyond the occasional drunk stumbling home from the saloon. They reached Morrison's building without incident, pressing against the wall in the alley behind it. Tom looked up at the second-story window, 15 feet high, reachable if he stood on a crate, and Danny climbed on his shoulders. Getting down would be harder, but they'd solve that problem when they came to it. "Remember the plan," Tom whispered. "You go in first. Open the window fully. I follow. We search quickly. Take only what we can carry. If anyone comes, you go out that window immediately. Don't wait for me. Run to the horses and get back to your mother." Danny nodded, his young face set with determination that looked wrong on someone so young. War did that. Created soldiers from children because circumstances allowed no alternative. Tom boosted Danny up. The boy was light, agile, moving with the natural grace of youth. He reached the window, tested it. Locked, but the lock was simple, the kind meant to deter casual thieves rather than determined intruders. Danny worked the blade of his small knife into the gap, wiggled it until something clicked. The window swung open. Within seconds, Danny had disappeared inside. Tom waited, counting heartbeats. Then Danny's head reappeared. "Clear. Come up." Tom climbed with less grace but adequate strength, pulling himself through the window with arms that remembered 23 years of hard labor. Inside, the office smelled of tobacco and old paper moonlight filtering through front windows, providing dim illumination. Morrison kept his records organized. Filing cabinets lined one wall, a large desk dominated the center of the room, and in the corner stood a safe. Iron-built solid with a combination lock that would take hours to crack if they didn't know the numbers. Tom moved to the filing cabinets first, pulling drawers open, scanning contents by the light of a small candle Danny had lit. Land deeds, survey maps, correspondence with railroad companies. Everything was meticulously filed, legally documented. Nothing here would prove Morrison's crimes. He'd been too careful, kept the legitimate business separate from the dirty work. "The safe," Danny whispered. "Important stuff is always in the safe." The boy was right. Tom crossed to the iron box and examined the combination lock. 3 numbers each between 1 and 60. The possible combinations numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They had no way to open it without the right sequence. "Try his birthday," Danny suggested. Tom looked at the boy with new respect. "You know Morrison's birthday?" "I saw his military medal in the display case downstairs. Had the date engraved. April 15th, 1833. "Smart kid." Tom tried the combination. 4-15-33. The lock didn't open. He tried variations. 15-4-33. Nothing. 33-15-4. The third attempt produced a satisfying click. The safe door swung open. Inside, Tom found what they'd come for. Not the sanitized business records kept in the filing cabinets, but the real documentation of Morrison's activities. Maps showing actual land boundaries versus the altered versions Morrison had recorded. Contracts with railroad companies paying premium prices for consolidated land. Letters between Morrison and territorial officials, money changing hands for favorable rulings. And at the bottom, a bundle of personal correspondence that made Tom's hands shake when he read it. Letters from Morrison to Billy Crow dating back years. Instructions for handling problems, eliminating obstacles, making examples of those who refused cooperation. One letter dated March 1877 stopped Tom's breath. Billy, the Harper situation requires resolution. The woman is stubborn despite my generous offers. Her husband refuses all contact. Standard pressure isn't working. Time for alternative methods. Contact your Apache friends. Make it look like a raid. Casualties acceptable if necessary to clear the property. Usual payment upon completion. Below it, Crow's response confirming the arrangement. Below that, a receipt for payment. $500 for Catherine's murder, itemized as land clearance services. Tom stood frozen, the letter in his hands, 8 years of grief and rage crystallizing into terrible clarity. Morrison hadn't just arranged Catherine's death. He'd paid for it. Had treated her murder as a business expense, something to be budgeted and executed like any other transaction. Danny touched his arm. "Mr. Harper, you okay?" Tom wasn't okay. Would never be okay again. But he forced himself to function, to keep moving. Tucked the letters into his coat. Grabbed the maps, the railroad contracts, everything that proved Morrison's systematic theft and violence. Then he found the list. A single sheet of paper handwritten in Morrison's distinctive script. 7 names, each followed by a date and a method. James Mitchell, cattle rustling conviction, died in custody. Robert Shaw, property accident, widow, sold for pennies. Catherine Harper, Apache, raid land abandoned. The list went on. 7 people destroyed, 7 families ruined, all in service of Morrison's expanding empire. "We need to go," Danny whispered urgently. "I heard something downstairs." Tom grabbed the list, stuffed it with the other documents. They'd gotten what they came for, now they just needed to escape with it. He moved to the window, stopped. The alley below showed movement, shadows resolving into men, 3 of them positioned to cut off escape. "Trap," Tom said quietly. Light flooded the office. Tom spun, hand moving to his Colt. Frank Morrison stood in the doorway, a lamp in one hand, a smile on his face. "I knew you'd come," Morrison said pleasantly. Predictable Tom, always so predictable. Billy Crow stepped in behind Morrison, gun drawn. Another man Tom didn't recognize took position at the other door. They were boxed in 3 armed men between them and freedom. Tom's mind raced through options. Fight their way out. Possible, but unlikely. Danny would be caught in the crossfire. Surrender. That meant arrest, trial, prison. Sarah and the children left defenseless. "Give me the papers," Morrison said. "You can walk out of here. I'll even forget this little breaking and entering incident. Business between old soldiers." Like Catherine was business? Tom's voice came out cold as January frost. Morrison's smile didn't waver. "You found the letters? Good. Then you understand. Nothing personal, Tom. Your land sits on an aquifer. The railroad needs reliable water for their steam engines. That land is worth $50,000 to the right buyer. Catherine was just in the way. Like you're in the way now. Like Mitchell was. Like everyone who doesn't have the sense to take my money and disappear. You killed her for water rights. I killed her for progress, for civilization, for the future of this territory." Morrison's voice held genuine conviction. One woman's life against the prosperity of thousands, that's not even a choice. It's mathematics. Tom's hand tightened on his Colt. One shot. He could drop Morrison right now. End this. But Billy Crow's gun was already pointed at Danny, and the third man had a shotgun leveled at Tom. They'd both die, and Morrison would still win. "Tom, be smart. You're outgunned. Give me what you stole and walk away. You can't win this." Danny spoke up, his young voice steady despite the fear Tom could see in his eyes. "My father thought he couldn't win either. He tried to do things the right way. Report the crimes. Trust the law. It got him killed." "Your father was weak," Morrison said dismissively. Couldn't accept that law is whatever people with power say it is. You don't have to repeat his mistake. He wasn't weak, Danny said. He was right, and you killed him for it. Morrison sighed. Billy, get the boy. Crow moved forward. Tom stepped between them, putting Danny behind him. His hand hovered near his gun, calculating odds, knowing they were terrible but seeing no alternative. Then Danny did something unexpected. He darted forward, grabbed Morrison's lamp and threw it at the filing cabinets. Oil spread fire caught papers ignited. Within seconds, flames climbed the wall. Morrison shouted. Billy Crow turned toward the fire. Tom used the distraction, lunging at Crow, slamming him against the wall. The gun discharged bullet punching through the ceiling. They grappled, Crow younger and faster, Tom older but desperate. Danny grabbed Morrison's dropped pistol, lifted it with both hands, pointed it at Morrison's chest. His hands shook, but the gun stayed level. "Don't move," Danny said. Morrison looked at the boy, then laughed. "You won't shoot. You're 9 years old. You don't have it in you." Tom slammed Crow's head against the wall. The man went limp. Tom grabbed his gun, turned toward Morrison. But Danny still held the pistol, still pointed it at the man who destroyed his family. "Danny," Tom said quietly, "give me the gun." "He killed my father." Danny's voice cracked. "He killed Mrs. Harper. He's trying to take everything. I should shoot him." "Yes, you should." Tom stepped beside the boy. "And if you do, you'll be exactly what he thinks you are. A child who solves problems with violence, just like him. He deserves to die." "Maybe, probably. But that's not your choice to make. That's not who you are." Morrison watched this exchange, his smile returning. "The boy won't shoot. He's weak like his father." Danny's finger tightened on the trigger. Tom held his breath. Then slowly Danny lowered the gun. "I'm not weak," Danny said clearly. "I'm better than you. I know when killing's wrong." Tom took the pistol from Danny's hands, pointed it at Morrison himself. His own finger rested on the trigger. How easy it would be. One squeeze. Justice for Catherine. For James Mitchell. For everyone Morrison had destroyed. The building was burning now, fire spreading quickly through dry wood and old papers. Smoke filled the room, making it hard to breathe. They needed to leave. But Tom held the gun steady, 8 years of grief demanding payment in blood. "Do it," Morrison said. "Pull the trigger. Become a murderer. See how that works out for you." The words cut through Tom's rage. Morrison was right. Shooting an unarmed man, even one who deserved it, would make Tom a criminal. Would make him no better than Morrison himself. Would dishonor Catherine's memory by using her death as excuse for revenge. Tom lowered the gun. "You're not worth it." "Then we're at an impasse. You can't shoot me. I can't let you leave with those documents. We'll all burn together. At least that's poetic." A voice came from the doorway. "Step away from him, Morrison." Marshal Henry Cole stood there, gun drawn, face grim. Behind him Robert Grant and 3 other men Tom recognized from town. Witnesses. People who'd finally found courage. Morrison's confidence cracked. "Henry, you're a bit late to the party." "Doc Hamilton brought me Catherine's journal 3 days ago," Cole said. "I've been investigating. Quietly. Found some interesting things. Like how you bribed Deputy Harris to lose evidence. How Judge Harlow gets 20% of your land company profits. How you paid Billy Crow for work that looks a lot like murder for hire." "Prove it," Morrison said. Tom held up the bundle of letters and contracts. "Already did. It's all here, your own records, your own handwriting." Morrison's face went pale. For the first time since Tom had known him, the man looked genuinely frightened. "Those were stolen, inadmissible." "Maybe," Cole said, "but they'll start an investigation. Federal investigators, not territorial ones you've bought. And once they start digging, they'll find everything. You're done, Frank." Morrison looked around the burning room, at Cole's gun, at Tom's cold expression, at Danny standing tall despite his youth. The empire he'd built on theft and murder was collapsing, and he could see it happening in real time. "Frank Morrison," Cole said formally. You're under arrest for bribery, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 6 other charges I'll add once I read through those documents. Turn around. Hands behind your back." Morrison didn't resist as Cole shackled him. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by cold calculation of how to minimize damage, which lawyers to hire, which officials might still be loyal enough to help. They evacuated the building as fire consumed the second floor. The town's volunteer fire brigade arrived, but the office was already lost. Morrison's records, at least the ones Tom hadn't stolen, burned to ash. Poetic justice, Tom thought. The man who'd burned Catherine's home now watched his own empire burn. Cole loaded Morrison into a wagon. "I'll need those documents, Tom." Tom handed them over. "Make sure they reach someone who can't be bought." "I will. Federal marshal's coming through next week. I'll give them to him directly." Cole paused. "I'm sorry it took this long. I should have acted sooner." "You acted when it mattered. That counts for something." Danny stood beside Tom, soot-stained and exhausted, but with his head high. Tom put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did good tonight, son." It was the first time he'd called Danny that. The word felt right natural. Danny looked up at him and something passed between them. Not quite father and son, not yet, but the foundation for it built on shared danger and mutual respect. They rode back to the ranch as dawn painted the sky orange and gold. Sarah waited on the porch, Emma asleep in her arms. When she saw them safe, tears of relief streamed down her face. Tom dismounted, went to her. No words seemed adequate. He just stood there letting her see that he'd kept his promise, that Danny was safe, that they'd survived the night. "It's over," he said finally. "Morrison's arrested. We have evidence. It's really over." Sarah looked at the sky, at the new day breaking over land that had known so much darkness. "Is it really?" Tom thought about that. Morrison was arrested, yes, but he had money connections, lawyers. The fight might continue for months, even years. Justice moved slowly, especially when fighting entrenched power. But something had changed. The secret was out. Morrison's crimes were known, and even if he escaped ultimate punishment, his empire would crumble. The fear he'd used to control the territory was broken. "Yes," Tom said with certainty. "It's over." 3 months passed. Spring came to Arizona with wildflowers and warm winds that carried promise instead of threat. Morrison stood trial not in territorial court, but federal, and the evidence proved overwhelming. His bought judges couldn't help him. His bribed officials abandoned him. The man who'd seemed untouchable fell hard and fast, sentenced to 15 years in Yuma Territorial Prison. Judge Harlow and 3 other officials faced their own charges. The corruption Morrison had built dissolved as people scrambled to save themselves, turning on each other in cascades of confession and accusation. Sarah's land claim was recognized as legitimate. The 80 acres near Mesa were returned to her ownership, along with compensation for the years they'd been held illegally. It wasn't much money, but it was something. Justice, however, delayed. Tom officially adopted Danny and Emma through territorial courts, making them legally his children. The paperwork meant little emotionally, the bonds already formed through shared struggle. But it mattered legally, giving them his name and his protection. The town of Prescott transformed its attitude with the shameless speed of people eager to be on the winning side. Peterson apologized for refusing service, tried to return the money Tom had paid months before. Tom refused. Some things couldn't be fixed with apologies. But other gestures he accepted. The blacksmith Jake Wilson came out to the ranch personally to help with spring repairs. Maria Rodriguez brought food, proper Mexican cooking, that filled the house with unfamiliar smells that somehow felt like home. Doc Hamilton visited weekly, checking on everyone's health, trying through actions to atone for his previous silence. Slowly, carefully, Tom and Sarah's household became part of the community again, not accepted by everyone. Prejudice didn't disappear just because Morrison had fallen, but enough people extended hands of friendship that isolation became choice rather than necessity. One afternoon in late May, Tom found himself working on fence repairs with Sarah helping. They'd fallen into comfortable silence, the kind possible between people who'd been through hardship together. Danny was at the forge teaching the Anderson boy whose family had returned after Morrison's arrest. Emma played with Rusty in the field, her laughter carrying on the wind. Tom paused his work, looking across at Sarah. She'd changed in the month since arriving at his door, cold and desperate, filled out some from regular meals, smiled more, carried herself with confidence rather than perpetual wariness. She'd found safety here, and safety had let her become herself again. "Marry me," Tom said. Sarah's hands stilled on the wire she'd been holding. "What, marry me? Not for the adoption papers, not for legal protection, for this." He gestured at the land around them, at the children, at the life they'd built. "For us." Sarah set down the wire carefully. "Tom, we've never even discussed." "I know. I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I know what I feel. And I know Catherine would understand. She'd want me to live, not just survive. You and the children you've given me reason to live again. I can't replace her. I'm not asking you to." Tom pulled something from his pocket. A simple silver ring, James Mitchell's wedding band, that Sarah had kept after his death. She'd shown it to him once late one night, explaining its significance. "And I can't replace him. But maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can honor what we had while building something new." Sarah took the ring, turned it over in her hands. "James would have liked you. He always said the measure of a man was what he did when no one was watching. You proved your measure." "Is that a yes?" She smiled. "Yes. It's a yes." The wedding happened 2 weeks later at the small church in Prescott. Not a large affair. Doc Hamilton attended, Robert Grant and his wife, Maria Rodriguez, Marshall Cole, a handful of townspeople who'd proven themselves friends. Pastor Williams, who'd initially condemned Tom for harboring Sarah, presided with good grace, having learned some humility from Morrison's fall. Tom wore his best clothes, which weren't very good. Sarah wore a simple dress Maria had helped her make pale blue like Arizona sky at dawn. Danny and Emma stood beside them, witnesses to their parents finding something like happiness again. The ceremony was brief. Tom and Sarah had both been married before, knew what the promises meant, and the weight they carried. They spoke their vows quietly but firmly. "I will. I do. Forever, or as close to forever as mortal beings could manage." After the ceremony, Tom did something he'd planned carefully. He took Sarah to the hill behind their house where Catherine's grave stood. Over the past month, he'd added another marker beside Catherine's. Simple gray stone like hers, carved with equal care. James Mitchell, 1842-1883, beloved father and husband, an honest man in dishonest times. Sarah gasped when she saw it, tears immediate and overwhelming. She'd thought James buried in a pauper's grave somewhere at Yuma, unmarked and forgotten. Tom had tracked down the location, had a proper headstone made, had it installed with the respect James deserved. "He should be remembered," Tom said quietly. "What he tried to do, what he died for, that matters." Sarah knelt before the marker, touching the carved letters. "Thank you. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He was trying to stop Morrison before Morrison destroyed more lives. If people had listened to him, Catherine might still be alive. We owe him this much. They stood together between the two graves, honoring the dead while choosing to keep living. It felt right somehow. Not forgetting, but not being trapped by the past either. Catherine and James had loved them, and that love deserved to be celebrated, not used as excuse to stop loving again. 6 months after the wedding, on a crisp October morning, Danny turned 10. He'd grown 3 inches, filled out from steady food and hard work. His hands showed calluses from the forge scars, from learning that hot metal doesn't forgive carelessness. He could make horseshoe nails that looked professional, could repair wagon wheels, could work iron with growing skill. But more importantly, he'd grown in other ways. The frightened, angry boy who'd arrived desperate for shelter had become someone different, confident, purposeful, starting to understand what being a man actually meant. That morning, Tom took Danny to the forge for a lesson different from the usual technical instruction. He brought with him a knife, old and well-maintained, its handle worn smooth from generations of use. "This belonged to my father," Tom said, handing it to Danny. "His father before him. My grandfather carried it when he came west in 1803. It's seen 4 wars built, 3 homesteads been passed down through men who knew that tools matter, but character matters more." Danny took the knife reverently, understanding he was receiving more than just a weapon. "I'll take care of it. I know you will. But there's something else I want you to understand about this knife and what it represents." Tom sat on the edge of the anvil, gestured for Danny to do the same. "You asked me once how you know when you're a man. Remember? You said when you can protect what you love without becoming what you hate." That's right. Morrison was strong, powerful. He protected what he loved, which was money and power. But he became something terrible in the process. And that's not strength. That's fear, pretending to be strength. Danny turned the knife over in his hands, processing this. Is real strength knowing when not to use it? Partly, but it's more than that. Real strength is choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, even when no one's watching. Even when taking the easy path would benefit you. Your father had that strength. He could have kept quiet about Morrison's fraud, could have saved himself. But he chose to speak up knowing what it might cost. It cost him everything. Yes, but he died an honest man, and that matters more than most people understand. Morrison's alive in prison, wealthy, still probably with lawyers working to reduce his sentence, but he'll die knowing everyone sees what he really is. Your father died knowing he'd tried to do right. Which man do you think sleeps better?" Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that proved he understood. "The knife's not the important part, is it? It's what the person holding it chooses to do with it." Tom smiled. "Now you're learning." They worked together that morning, forging more than metal. Tom showed Danny advanced techniques, trusting him with real responsibility. And Danny rose to meet that trust, proving himself worthy of the legacy being passed down. That afternoon, Emma demonstrated her own growth in quieter ways. She'd become Rusty's primary caretaker, feeding him, grooming him, exercising him with a dedication that went beyond assigned chores. The old horse had responded to her care, seemed younger, somehow, livelier. Tom watched from the porch as Emma led Rusty through a series of simple maneuvers, talking to him constantly in her soft voice. Sarah stood beside Tom, following his gaze. "She's happy," Sarah said. "Really happy. I haven't seen her this way since before James died. She's got a gift. Animals trust her. People trust her too. She's the one who convinced the Anderson girl to start talking again after their house burned. Just sat with her, didn't push, let her be silent until she was ready. That takes wisdom you don't usually see in 7-year-olds. Tom agreed. Emma had suffered, had known fear and loss, but instead of hardening her, it had opened some well of compassion that flowed naturally toward anything hurting. The world needed people like that, protected them too rarely. Emma led Rusty to the water trough, then turned and saw Tom and Sarah watching. Her face lit up with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. She waved, then ran toward them. "Papa!" The word came out naturally, as if she'd been saying it forever. "Did you see Rusty? Did you see how he's walking better?" "Papa?" Tom's throat tightened. She'd been calling him that for a month now, but it still hit him every time. He knelt down as she reached him, letting her throw arms around his neck in an enthusiastic hug. "I saw. You're doing good work with him. He was lonely before. Now he's not." Emma pulled back, looked at him seriously. "Were you lonely before, too?" The directness of children. No filter, no social nicety, just honest questions demanding honest answers. "Yes," Tom said. "I was." "Are you still?" "No, not anymore." Emma smiled, satisfied with this answer. She hugged him again quickly, then ran back to Rusty, ready to continue her care of the old horse. Tom stood, found Sarah watching him with soft expression. "Papa suits you," she said. "It feels right." "Good, because you're stuck with it now." They stood together on the porch watching their children, this family that had formed from loss and necessity but had become something real and solid. Not perfect, real families never were, but genuine, built on choice rather than obligation. on love earned through hardship rather than assumed through blood. 1 year after Morrison's arrest in the spring of 1887. Tom climbed the hill behind the house where Catherine and James rested. The graves were well-tended flowers growing wild around the markers, a small fence Tom had built to protect them from weather and wildlife. He sat on a flat rock he'd positioned for this purpose, looking down at the ranch. The view showed transformation. 2 houses now instead of 1, the second a small structure Tom and Danny had built together for when the boy grew old enough to need his own space. 25 cattle grazed in the expanded pasture the herd grown from profits of the past year. Sarah's garden flourished behind the main house, vegetables and herbs thriving under her careful attention. Tom had repaid the bank debt, had money in reserve for emergencies. The land was fully his with Sarah's name added to the deed as co-owner. Not because law required it, but because partnership mattered. They'd built this together. He looked at Catherine's grave. "I hope you understand," he said quietly. "I hope wherever you are, you know I didn't forget you. But I couldn't keep living like I was dead. These people needed me, and I needed them." The wind whispered through grass, carrying no answers, but no accusations either. Tom chose to believe that meant acceptance. He turned to James's marker. "Your children are safe, strong. Danny's learning to be the man you would have wanted him to be. Emma's got your compassion, your way of seeing good in things. Sarah's happy again, or as happy as people can be who've known real loss. I'll take care of them. You have my word." Below movement caught his eye. Sarah emerged from the house, Danny beside her. They were working on something together, their heads close in consultation. Emma played with Rusty in the field, her laughter floating up the hill like music. Robert Grant's wagon approached on the road, probably bringing news or supplies, or just visiting because they'd become genuine friends. The Anderson family's son worked at the forge, learning from Danny, now the student becoming teacher. Life continued, full of small moments that added up to something meaningful. Tom stood preparing to descend the hill and rejoin the living, but he paused at the graves one final time. "Thank you," he said, "both of you, for loving people who could learn to love again, for giving us reason to keep fighting. We won't forget." He walked down the hill toward his family. Sarah saw him coming, smiled that smile that still made his heart catch slightly. Danny waved, eager to show him whatever project they'd been discussing. Emma broke away from Rusty and ran to meet him, full of energy and innocence and joy. Tom reached them and let himself be swept into the chaos of family life. Questions about dinner, discussions about fence repairs. Emma demanding he watch Rusty's new trick, Danny wanting advice on a difficult forging problem. Normal things, beautiful because they were normal. That evening, as sunset painted the Arizona sky in shades of amber and rose, Tom stood at the door of his home. The door wasn't locked, hadn't been locked in months. No need anymore. The house held people worth protecting, and protection came from vigilance and community, not from iron bars and isolation. Inside, Sarah set the table for dinner. 4 places, 4 people, a family. Danny helped, moving with easy familiarity around a space that was completely his. Emma played with a kitten they'd found abandoned weeks ago, another creature she'd adopted and nurtured back to health. The house smelled of cooking food, of life being lived. Voices overlapped in comfortable conversation. Laughter erupted from something Emma said. The sound-filled spaces that had been silent too long drove shadows from corners that darkness had claimed. Tom stepped inside, closing the door behind him, not locking it, just closing it against the evening chill. The lamplight caught his family in warm amber, painting them gold and alive and here. Sarah looked up from the stove. "Dinner's almost ready. Wash up." Simple words, domestic and ordinary. But they held everything Tom had thought lost forever: belonging, purpose, the knowledge that tomorrow mattered because people he loved would be in it. He washed his hands, sat at the table. Danny and Emma took their places. Sarah brought food, set it down, sat beside Tom. They held hands as Tom said a brief grace thanking powers he wasn't sure he believed in for blessings he knew were real. They ate together, talking and laughing, making plans for tomorrow and next week and next year. Outside the valley settled into night stars, emerging one by one. The land stretched vast and beautiful, holding promise and challenge in equal measure. But inside this house, warmth prevailed. Love prevailed. A family forged from loss had found its way to something like happiness. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and solid and worth every fight they'd endured to reach this moment. Tom looked at Sarah across the table at Danny, earnestly explaining something at Emma's animated gestures as she told a story. This was his life now, not the one he'd planned, not the one he'd lost, but the one he'd chosen to build from ashes and grief and unexpected grace. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The evening deepened, stories were told, plans were made. Eventually, tiredness claimed them. Emma fell asleep in her chair, requiring Tom to carry her to bed. Danny followed shortly after his day of work, catching up. Sarah and Tom remained sitting together in the quiet hands intertwined. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "For what? For not turning us away. For fighting when you could have stayed safe. For choosing us." Tom squeezed her hand. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost. Purpose. Reason to wake up tomorrow. If anything, I should be thanking you." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind possible only between people who'd earned each other's trust through hardship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The frontier was never easy, never safe. But they'd face it together, this family built from choice and strengthened through fire. Outside, the Arizona night sang its ancient song of wind and stars and endless sky. Inside a house that had been dead for 8 years, lived again, filled with breath and heartbeat and hope. Tom Harper, soldier and rancher, widower and father, had survived the war and the loss and the long years of isolation, had survived Morrison's violence and the frontier's harshness, had survived grief that should have destroyed him. But more than that, he'd learned to live again, to love again, to build something worth protecting with every tool at his disposal, including the one he'd almost forgotten existed, his heart, and that he thought as sleep finally claimed him beside the woman who'd reminded him what living meant. That was the real victory. Not the land, or the money, or even the justice, but the simple, profound miracle of choosing to keep your heart open even when the world gave you every reason to close it. The Harper Ranch stood strong that night, as it had for years, as it would for years to come. A testament not to one man's stubborn survival, but to what could be built when people chose connection over isolation, when they chose to stand together rather than fall alone. The story didn't end there. It never really ends. Life continues, brings new challenges, offers new joys. But that night marked something, a completion. A circle closed and another beginning. In the years that followed, Danny would grow to manhood and take a wife and build his own house on the land Tom had fought to protect. Emma would become a healer, using her gift with animals to help people understand their livestock, their land, their connection to the world around them. Sarah and Tom would grow old together, their hands finding each other across decades of shared mornings. The ranch would pass to another generation, then another. The original homestead would become legend, the story of how Tom Harper stood against Frank Morrison, becoming the kind of tale grandfathers told grandchildren about when courage mattered and men did right. But all of that was future unseen and unwritten. That night, as the family slept under Arizona stars, the present was enough. More than enough. It was everything.